Hey there, welcome back to the channel. Before we dive into tonight's journey, I'd really appreciate it if you could hit that like button if you enjoy what we explore here together. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing our global community come together through these deep dives into our planet's incredible past. Now, settle in, maybe dim those lights, and let's travel back to a world that would challenge everything you think you know about survival. We're heading to East Africa, 6.3 million years ago, where the very foundations of what it means to hunt, to strategize, and to survive were being written in blood and bone. You've just awakened in the East African Rift Valley during the late Miocene epoch. The sun breaks over a landscape that's both familiar and utterly alien. Rolling grasslands stretch toward distant volcanic peaks. But this isn't the Africa you know from documentaries. This is a continent in transformation, where ancient forests are giving way to something entirely new, vast savannas dotted with isolated woodland patches. The air carries scents you'd never encounter in the modern world. The earthy richness of volcanic soil mingles with the musk of creatures that have been extinct for millions of years. And the sounds. They're a symphony of survival that would both mesmerize and terrify you. Somewhere in the distance, a roar echoes across the plains, but it doesn't belong to any lion you've ever heard of. Welcome to the Miocene, a time when the very concept of hunting was being revolutionized by creatures whose strategies would influence predator behavior for millions of years to come. This wasn't just about catching prey. This was about the birth of intelligence in the hunt, the emergence of social coordination, and the development of techniques so sophisticated they'd make modern predators look like amateurs. But here's what's truly fascinating. The hunting strategies that emerged during this period didn't just shape the animal kingdom. They laid the groundwork for evolutionary innovations that would eventually influence our own ancestors. Every coordinated attack, every strategic ambush, every calculated risk was writing the playbook for survival that echoes through time. Tonight, we're going to explore how creatures in this ancient world didn't just hunt for food. They hunted with purpose, with strategy, with an intelligence that would redefine what it meant to be a predator. We'll witness hunting techniques that were so advanced, so perfectly adapted to their environment, that they dominated the East African landscape for millions of years. And trust me, by the end of this journey, you'll never look at modern predators the same way again. Because what we're about to discover isn't just natural history, it's the origin story of strategic thinking itself, written in the dust and bones of creatures whose names have been lost to time, but whose legacy lives on in every successful hunt that happens today. The East African Rift Valley, 6.3 million years ago, was a masterpiece of geological violence and biological opportunity. Picture a landscape caught between two worlds, where ancient Miocene forests were slowly surrendering to expanding grasslands, creating a patchwork environment unlike anything that exists today. Massive volcanic peaks dominated the horizon, their slopes scarred by recent eruptions that had reshaped the terrain. The Great Rift itself was younger then, its walls less defined, but the geological forces that would eventually split Africa in two were already hard at work. Rivers carved through the landscape in patterns that seemed almost random, creating a network of water sources that would become the focal points for some of the most dramatic hunting scenarios in Earth's history. This wasn't the harsh, dry savanna many people imagine when they think of ancient Africa. The climate was warmer and more humid than today's East Africa, supporting a mosaic of environments that ranged from dense riverine forests to open grasslands dotted with acacia-like trees. Seasonal rains were more reliable, creating predictable patterns of abundance and scarcity that smart predators learned to exploit. But perhaps the most remarkable feature of this landscape was its sheer productivity. The volcanic soil, enriched by countless eruptions, supported plant communities so lush and diverse that they could sustain herbivore populations of staggering size and variety. Imagine herds that stretched to the horizon, not just of one or two species, but of dozens of different creatures, each filling its own ecological niche. The grasslands themselves were different from anything we see today. They were punctuated by gallery forests that followed river courses, creating corridors of dense vegetation that connected larger woodland areas. These forest corridors became highways for some species and deadly ambush points for others. The interplay between open ground and cover created opportunities for hunting strategies that required not just strength or speed, but genuine tactical thinking. Water sources were abundant but scattered, creating natural gathering points where prey animals had to venture into the open, away from the safety of forest cover. These watering holes became theatres of predation, where the most successful hunters developed techniques that combined patience, timing, and coordinated attacks. The landscape was also marked by seasonal patterns that were far more extreme than what we see in modern East Africa. Wet seasons brought floods that could isolate populations on temporary islands, while dry periods concentrated animals around shrinking water sources. These dramatic environmental swings created evolutionary pressures that favored hunters capable of adapting their strategies to changing conditions. Rocky outcrops and escarpments provided elevated hunting grounds, offering predators the high ground advantage that military strategists would later recognize as crucial for tactical superiority. The terrain was rugged enough to challenge any creature attempting to traverse it, but not so hostile as to prevent the development of complex ecosystems. This was a landscape that rewarded intelligence, cooperation, and innovation. It punished the rigid and the predictable, while favoring creatures that could think several moves ahead. The geography itself became a participant in the evolutionary arms race between predator and prey, shaping hunting strategies that were as much about reading the land as reading the behavior of target species. In this environment, successful hunters needed to be geologists, meteorologists, and behavioral psychologists, all rolled into one. They had to understand how terrain affected movement patterns, how weather influenced prey behavior, and how the complex interaction of multiple species created opportunities for those smart enough to recognize them. The stage was set for an evolutionary drama, where the most successful players would be those who could turn the landscape itself into a weapon. And as we're about to discover, the creatures that mastered this art developed hunting strategies so sophisticated they seem almost supernatural by today's standards. Into this complex landscape stepped the most formidable predator of the late Miocene, a creature whose hunting strategies would influence carnivore behavior for millions of years to come. Meet the Mecherodontines, the saber-toothed cats whose very name has become synonymous with prehistoric predation. But these weren't the lumbering, brutish killers that popular imagination often portrays. The saber-toothed cats of 6.3 million years ago were elegant, intelligent hunters, whose elongated canine teeth were just the most visible part of a perfectly integrated killing system. Their bodies were built for precision strikes, with powerful forelimbs designed to grapple and hold prey, while those famous sabers delivered surgical wounds to specific vital areas. The largest of these magnificent predators stood nearly 4 feet at the shoulder and weighed as much as a modern tiger, but their hunting style was completely different from any big cat alive today. Where modern big cats typically suffocate their prey with throat bites, saber-toothed cats use their elongated teeth to slash major blood vessels or pierce specific organs, creating wounds that would incapacitate prey through rapid blood loss. But here's where it gets truly fascinating. These cats didn't hunt alone, and they didn't rely purely on ambush tactics. Archaeological evidence suggests they developed some of the first truly coordinated group hunting strategies seen in the fossil record. Bone sites from this period show kill patterns that indicate multiple individuals working together to bring down prey much larger than themselves. Their social structure was more complex than that of modern big cats. Groups of saber-toothed cats developed hierarchical hunting parties where different individuals played specific roles. Some members specialized in the initial attack, using their powerful builds to knock prey off balance. Others focused on maintaining the grapple, their strong forelimbs designed to prevent escape. And finally, the most skilled hunters delivered the killing bite with surgical precision. The coordination required for these hunts demanded a level of communication and planning that pushed the boundaries of what we typically associate with prehistoric predators. They developed a sophisticated system of vocalizations, body language, and positioning that allowed them to execute complex hunting maneuvers with remarkable efficiency. Their prey presented unique challenges that required equally unique solutions. The herbivores of this period were often massive, heavily built creatures with their own defensive strategies. Mastodons roamed the landscape alongside early giraffeids, whose necks weren't quite as elongated as modern giraffes, but whose size still made them formidable opponents. These prey animals had evolved their own counter-strategies, traveling in herds, posting sentries, and developing early warning systems that could alert entire groups to approaching danger. The saber-toothed cats responded by developing what can only be described as battlefield tactics. They learned to use terrain to their advantage, positioning themselves upwind and using natural features like rock formations or dense vegetation to mask their approach. They developed the patience to wait for hours, even days, for the perfect opportunity to strike. But perhaps most remarkably, they began to demonstrate what we might recognize today as strategic thinking. They didn't just react to prey behavior, they anticipated it. Bone sites show evidence of ambush points chosen not for immediate proximity to prey, but for locations where prey would be forced to pass during seasonal migrations or daily movement patterns. These cats also developed specialized hunting techniques for different types of prey. When hunting thick-skinned megafauna, they coordinated attacks that targeted specific vulnerable points: the base of the neck, the inner thighs where major arteries ran close to the surface, or joints where their sabers could penetrate between bones. Each attack was tailored to the anatomy and behavior of the specific target species. The evolution of their hunting strategies was driven by an arms race with their prey that pushed both predator and prey to develop increasingly sophisticated behaviors. As herbivores became more alert and developed better defensive strategies, the saber-toothed cats responded with more complex hunting techniques that required not just individual skill, but group coordination and long-term planning. Their success transformed the entire ecosystem. Other predators were forced to adapt their own hunting strategies or risk being outcompeted for resources. This created a cascade of evolutionary pressure that influenced carnivore behavior patterns throughout the late Miocene and beyond. The legacy of these remarkable hunters extends far beyond their own extinction. The hunting strategies they pioneered, the social structures they developed, and the cognitive abilities they demonstrated laid the groundwork for predator behavior patterns that we can still observe in modern carnivores. They proved that successful hunting wasn't just about physical prowess. It was about intelligence, cooperation, and the ability to adapt strategies to changing conditions. But the saber-toothed cats weren't the only innovative hunters stalking the East African landscape. As we're about to discover, they shared their territory with other predators whose hunting strategies were equally sophisticated, but based on entirely different principles. The competition between these different hunting philosophies would drive an evolutionary arms race that pushed the boundaries of what it meant to be a successful predator in the ancient world. While the saber-toothed cats were perfecting their precision strikes and coordinated ambushes, another group of predators was developing hunting strategies based on an entirely different philosophy. The Amphicyonids, often called bear dogs, represented a completely alternative approach to predation that would challenge everything the saber-toothed cats had established as the standard for successful hunting. These creatures were evolutionary marvels in their own right, combining the powerful build of bears with the hunting instincts and pack mentality of canids. But calling them bear dogs sells them short, because what they really were was something entirely new. A predator designed from the ground up for for a style of hunting that had never been seen before in the fossil record. The Amphichonids weren't built for the surgical precision of saber-toothed cats. Instead, they were engineered for sustained pursuit and overwhelming force. Their legs were longer relative to their body size than those of modern bears, giving them the endurance to maintain pursuit over vast distances. Their jaws were less specialized than those of the saber-toothed cats, but they were incredibly powerful, capable of crushing bone and delivering devastating bite forces that could incapacitate prey through sheer trauma rather than precise blood loss. But here's where their hunting strategy becomes truly remarkable. While saber-toothed cats relied on ambush and short, explosive attacks, Amphichonids developed what we might recognize today as persistence hunting. They didn't need to get close to their prey undetected because they didn't plan to rely on surprise. Instead, they developed the ability to simply outlast their targets. Their hunting parties operated more like military units than the fluid, opportunistic groups formed by saber-toothed cats. Amphichonid packs developed rigid hierarchies with specialized roles that went far beyond the basic coordination seen in other predators. Scout individuals ranged ahead of the main pack, identifying potential targets and assessing their condition. These scouts had to possess not just speed and stealth, but the intelligence to evaluate whether a particular prey animal was worth the enormous energy investment that Amphichonid hunting required. Once a target was selected, the pack would begin what could only be described as a campaign rather than a simple hunt. They would shadow their chosen prey for hours, sometimes days, gradually increasing the psychological pressure while carefully managing their own energy reserves. This wasn't mindless pursuit, it was calculated warfare designed to break down the mental and physical defenses of their targets before the final attack ever began. The Amphicyonids understood something about prey behavior that even modern predators rarely exploit so systematically. They recognized that most herbivores, no matter how large or well defended, had breaking points. By maintaining constant low-level pressure, never quite attacking but never disappearing, they could gradually exhaust not just the physical reserves of their prey, but their psychological resilience as well. Their pack coordination during these extended hunts required communication systems more sophisticated than anything seen in contemporary predators. They developed a complex vocabulary of vocalizations, each with specific meanings that could be understood by pack members over considerable distances. Different calls indicated the condition of the prey, the terrain ahead, the availability of water sources, and the timing for various phases of the hunt. But perhaps most remarkably, they learned to use the landscape as a strategic weapon in ways that went beyond simple ambush tactics. Amphichonid hunting parties would deliberately drive prey towards specific terrain features that would give them advantages during the final assault. They identified areas where the ground was soft enough to tire heavy herbivores, locations where natural barriers would prevent escape, and positions where the pack could attack from multiple directions simultaneously. The energy management required for this style of hunting demanded planning abilities that bordered on the extraordinary. Pack leaders had to calculate not just the energy expenditure of the hunt itself, but the resources needed for pack members to return to den sites, the availability of water along pursuit routes, and the seasonal patterns that would affect prey behavior. A miscalculation could result in the death of multiple pack members, making every hunt a high-stakes decision that required genuine strategic thinking. Their success rate was lower than that of ambush predators, but when Amphicyonids succeeded, they succeeded spectacularly. Their ability to bring down prey many times their individual size meant that a single successful hunt could feed an entire pack for weeks. This feast or famine lifestyle created social structures and food-sharing behaviors that were unlike anything seen in other contemporary predators. The competition between Amphicyonids and saber-toothed cats created one of the most fascinating predator dynamics in the fossil record. These two groups rarely competed directly for the same prey, but their presence in the same ecosystem forced both to develop increasingly sophisticated strategies to avoid interference from the other. Saber-toothed cats had to factor amphissionid pack territories into their ambush site selection, while amphicionids had to modify their pursuit routes to avoid areas where saber-toothed cats might be waiting to steal their kills. This competitive pressure drove both groups to develop what we might recognize today as intelligence-gathering capabilities. Both predator types learned to read the signs left by their competitors, understanding territorial boundaries, hunting schedules, and preferred prey types. They developed the ability to predict where their rivals would be and when, allowing them to plan their own hunting activities to minimize conflicts while maximizing success rates. But the amphicionids faced challenges that went beyond simple competition with other predators. Their hunting style required vast territories to be sustainable, and as the climate began to shift during the late Miocene, those territories were becoming increasingly fragmented. The expansion of grasslands was creating barriers between woodland areas where amphicionids were most effective, forcing them to adapt their strategies to more open environments where their persistence hunting techniques were less advantageous. This environmental pressure drove some amphicionid populations to develop even more sophisticated hunting strategies. They began to incorporate elements of ambush tactics into their persistence hunting, learning to use the expanded grasslands to their advantage by coordinating long-distance pursuits that would drive prey into predetermined ambush sites operated by other pack members. The cognitive demands of these hybrid hunting strategies pushed amphicionid intelligence to remarkable levels. Pack members had to understand not just their own role in the hunt, but the timing and positioning of multiple other participants across distances that might span several miles. They developed the ability to maintain mental maps of complex terrain features and to coordinate their movements with pack members they couldn't see or hear directly. Their social learning capabilities were equally impressive. Young amphicionids underwent extended training periods, where they learned not just the physical skills needed for hunting, but the strategic thinking required to participate in complex, multi-phase operations. This knowledge transfer system ensured that successful hunting innovations were preserved and passed down through generations, creating a cumulative cultural evolution that enhanced the effectiveness of their techniques over time. The amphicionids proved that there was more than one path to success in the predator arms race of the late Miocene. While saber-toothed cats dominated through precision and coordination, amphicionids succeeded through endurance and strategic persistence. Both approaches were valid, both were effective, and both contributed to the rich tapestry of hunting strategies that characterize this remarkable period in Earth's history. But even as these two giants of predation were perfecting their respective hunting philosophies, other creatures were developing strategies that would prove equally innovative and perhaps even more influential in the long run. The stage was set for an evolutionary drama where multiple competing approaches to predation would push the boundaries of animal intelligence and forever change the meaning of what it meant to hunt successfully in the ancient world. But the true masters of innovation in this ancient landscape weren't the massive saber-toothed cats or the relentless amphicionids. They were creatures that most people have never heard of, predators whose hunting strategies were so far ahead of their time that they seem almost impossible. Meet the early hyenids, the ancestors of modern hyenas, but these weren't the scavenging opportunists that popular culture often portrays their descendants as being. The hyenids of 6.3 million years ago were sophisticated pack hunters whose strategies combined the best elements of both ambush and persistence hunting, while adding innovations that neither saber-toothed cats nor amphicionids had conceived of. They were the first predators to develop what we might recognize today as psychological warfare, hunting techniques designed not just to capture prey, but to manipulate their behavior in ways that made capture inevitable. These early hyenids possessed something that set them apart from every other predator in the East African Rift. They had learned to hunt with their minds as much as their bodies. Their physical attributes were impressive, but not extraordinary. They were roughly the size of modern spotted hyenas with powerful jaws and strong hindquarters. But what made them truly formidable was their ability to think several steps ahead of both their prey and their competitors. Their pack structure was unlike anything seen in contemporary predators. While saber-toothed cats formed loose hunting coalitions and amphicyonids organized into rigid military-style hierarchies, hyenids developed something far more sophisticated. They created what can only be described as intelligence networks, with individual pack members specializing not just in different aspects of the hunt, but in different types of information gathering and strategic analysis. Some pack members became specialists in reading prey behavior, developing an almost supernatural ability to predict the movements and reactions of different herbivore species. These behavioral specialists could observe a herd for mere minutes and determine which individuals were sick, injured, or simply less alert than the others. They could identify which animals were likely to panic first, which ones would stand and fight, and which ones would attempt to flee in specific directions. Other pack members specialized in what we might call environmental intelligence. They became experts in reading weather patterns, understanding how changes in wind direction, humidity, and barometric pressure would affect both prey behavior and hunting conditions. These environmental specialists could predict where prey would seek shelter during storms, which water sources they would favor during different seasons, and how terrain features would channel animal movements during times of stress. But perhaps most remarkably, some hyenids developed into what can only be described as strategic coordinators. These individuals possess the cognitive ability to process information from multiple specialists, synthesize it into comprehensive hunting plans, and communicate those plans to the entire pack through a sophisticated system of vocalizations, scent marking, and body language. The hunting strategies that emerged from this intelligence-based approach were unlike anything that had ever existed in the predator world. Hyenid packs didn't just hunt animals, they manipulated entire ecosystems to create hunting opportunities. They learned to use the presence of other predators as tools in their own hunts, deliberately driving prey toward areas where saber-toothed cats or amphicyonids were known to be active, then timing their own attacks to capitalize on the chaos that ensued. They developed techniques for hunting that spanned not just hours or days, but weeks or even months. Hyenid packs would identify specific prey populations during the wet season and begin subtle manipulations of their behavior patterns, gradually conditioning them to use specific travel routes, water sources, and feeding areas. Then, during the dry season when prey was most vulnerable, they would execute coordinated attacks that seemed to come out of nowhere, but were actually the culmination of months of careful preparation. Their understanding of prey psychology was so advanced that they could induce panic in herds without ever revealing their presence. By leaving scent trails in specific patterns, making barely audible vocalizations at calculated intervals, and positioning themselves just beyond the edge of prey detection ranges, they could create an atmosphere of generalized anxiety that would eventually cause entire herds to abandon favorable feeding areas and move toward locations where hyenid attacks were more likely to succeed. But the most extraordinary aspect of hyenid hunting strategy was their development of what modern military strategists would recognize as deception operations. They learned to stage fake attacks that were information about defensive responses and designed not to capture prey, but to gather escape routes. These mock hunts allowed them to test prey reactions under controlled conditions, building detailed mental maps of how different species and individuals would respond to various types of threats. The intelligence requirements for these deception operations were staggering. Pack members had to coordinate false attacks that appeared genuine enough to trigger authentic prey responses, while simultaneously observing and recording those responses for future analysis. They had to maintain their deceptions long enough to gather useful information, but not so long that they exhausted their own energy reserves or revealed their true intentions to competing predators. The success of these strategies created evolutionary pressure that influenced the behavior of every other species in the ecosystem. Prey animals began developing counterintelligence capabilities, learning to distinguish between genuine threats and hyenid deception operations. Other predators started copying hyenid techniques, leading to an arms race in strategic thinking that pushed the cognitive boundaries of multiple species simultaneously. The social learning systems that hyenids developed to pass these complex strategies from one generation to the next were equally remarkable. Young hyenids underwent extended apprenticeships that lasted for years, during which they learned not just hunting techniques, but strategic thinking processes. They were taught to observe, analyze, and synthesize information from multiple sources, to think in terms of long-term consequences rather than immediate results, and to coordinate their activities with pack members across vast distances and timescales. The hyenid education system created what we might recognize today as a military academy for predators. Young pack members rotated through different specializations, learning the skills of behavioral analysis, environmental intelligence, and strategic coordination before eventually settling into their adult roles. This comprehensive training ensured that the sophisticated hunting strategies developed by one generation were not just preserved, but improved upon by the next. But perhaps the most significant innovation of the hyenids was their development of what can only be called strategic patience. Unlike other predators, who were driven by immediate hunger or opportunistic encounters with prey, hyenids learned to delay gratification in service of larger strategic objectives. They would pass up easy hunting opportunities if those kills would interfere with longer-term plans. They developed the ability to maintain complex strategies over extended periods, even when those strategies required short-term sacrifices of food, territory, or energy. This strategic patience allowed hyenids to execute hunting plans of breathtaking complexity. They would spend months positioning different pack members in seemingly random locations across hundreds of square miles, then trigger coordinated movements that would drive multiple prey herds toward predetermined convergence points where the entire pack could participate in massive synchronized attacks. The logistics of coordinating these continent-spanning operations required communication systems and organizational abilities that challenged the limits of what we thought possible for prehistoric predators. Pack members had to maintain awareness of the positions and activities of dozens of other individuals across vast distances, coordinate their movements according to complex timing sequences, and adapt their plans in real time based on changing conditions and unexpected developments. The hyenids proved that intelligence, properly organized and strategically applied, could overcome almost any physical disadvantage. They competed successfully against predators that were larger, stronger, and better armed, simply by being smarter and more organized. Their hunting success rates were higher than those of any contemporary predator, and their techniques were so effective that they began to influence the evolutionary development of their prey species in measurable ways. Herbivores that survived in hyenid territories developed enhanced cognitive abilities of their own, learning to recognize and counter the complex strategies being employed against them. This created a feedback loop that pushed both predator and prey toward higher levels of intelligence and strategic thinking. The East African Rift became a laboratory for the evolution of mind-based survival strategies that would influence the development of animal intelligence for millions of years to come. But the hyenids' greatest contribution to the evolutionary record wasn't their individual hunting success. It was their demonstration that cooperation based on intelligence sharing could create capabilities that went far beyond what any individual could achieve alone. They pioneered the concept of collective intelligence in the predator world, showing that groups of individuals could function as integrated information processing systems capable of solving problems that would be impossible for single animals to handle. The principles they established, intelligence gathering, strategic planning, coordinated execution, and adaptive learning, became the foundation for advanced predator behavior throughout the rest of the Miocene and beyond. Their influence can be traced through the fossil record, appearing in the hunting strategies of later predator species that never had direct contact with the original hyenid innovators. As the landscape of East Africa continued to change during the late Miocene, the stage was set for even more dramatic innovations in hunting strategy. The cognitive arms race initiated by the competition between saber-toothed cats, amphicyonids, and hyenids was about to accelerate, driven by environmental pressures that would force all three groups to develop hunting techniques that pushed the absolute limits of animal intelligence and cooperation. The environmental pressures that had been building throughout the late Miocene were about to reach a breaking point. Climate patterns that had remained stable for millions of years began shifting in ways that would test every hunting strategy that had evolved in the East African Rift. The reliable seasonal rains started becoming unpredictable. Wet seasons arrived late or not at all, while dry periods stretched longer than any living creature had experienced. These changes didn't just affect the availability of water and vegetation. They fundamentally altered the behavioral patterns that predators had learned to exploit over countless generations. Herbivore migration routes that had been predictable for millennia suddenly shifted as traditional water sources dried up and new ones appeared in unexpected locations. The careful strategic planning that hyenids had perfected became far more challenging when the basic parameters of the ecosystem were constantly changing. But rather than being defeated by these environmental challenges, the most successful predators began developing adaptive hunting strategies that were even more sophisticated than anything they had achieved during periods of stability. They learned to hunt uncertainty itself, turning the unpredictability of their environment into a weapon that could be used against less adaptable prey and competitors. The saber-toothed cats were the first to recognize that environmental instability created new types of opportunities. As traditional ambush sites became unreliable due to changing vegetation patterns and water availability, they developed mobile ambush strategies that could be rapidly deployed in response to shifting conditions. Instead of learning specific terrain features, they learned to read the principles that governed how terrain would channel animal movement under different environmental conditions. Their hunting groups became more fluid and responsive, capable of reorganizing their tactics within hours rather than days. Individual cats developed multiple specializations, allowing hunting parties to adapt their composition based on current conditions, rather than maintaining fixed roles. A cat that specialized in woodland ambush techniques during wet seasons might become a grassland pursuit specialist when drought conditions opened up formerly forested areas. But the most remarkable adaptation was their development of what can only be described as predictive hunting. Saber-toothed cat groups began maintaining mental models of how environmental changes would affect prey behavior days or even weeks in advance. They learned to position themselves not where prey was currently located, but where prey would be forced to go as environmental pressures intensified. This predictive capability required unprecedented levels of environmental awareness and strategic thinking. Cats had to understand not just immediate weather patterns, but the complex interactions between climate, vegetation, water availability, and animal behavior that would determine prey movements over extended periods. They developed the ability to read subtle environmental cues that indicated impending changes in ecosystem conditions, allowing them to begin repositioning for hunting opportunities before those opportunities became obvious to their competitors. The amphicyonids faced even greater challenges from environmental instability. Their persistent hunting strategies required predictable territory boundaries and reliable water sources along pursuit routes. As these became unreliable, they were forced to develop revolutionary new approaches to pack hunting that incorporated levels of real-time adaptation that had never been seen before in the fossil record. They created what modern military strategists would recognize as rapid deployment forces, small specialized units that could be quickly positioned to take advantage of temporary hunting opportunities created by environmental changes. These rapid response teams were composed of the most experienced and intelligent pack members, individuals capable of making complex tactical decisions without input from the main pack leadership structure. But perhaps more importantly, they developed distributed intelligence networks that allowed pack members to maintain coordination even when environmental conditions forced them to operate across much larger territories than had previously been possible. Individual amphicyonids learned to function as autonomous decision-making units, while remaining connected to the larger pack through sophisticated communication systems that could operate effectively across the expanded distances that environmental instability had forced upon them. The energy management challenges posed by these new hunting strategies pushed amphicyonid intelligence to remarkable levels. Pack leaders had to calculate resource expenditure not just for individual hunts, but for entire sequences of hunts that might span weeks or months as environmental conditions shifted. They developed the ability to maintain multiple contingency plans simultaneously, switching between different strategic approaches based on real-time environmental feedback without losing the coordination that made pack hunting effective. The hyenids, already the most cognitively advanced predators in the ecosystem, responded to environmental instability by developing what can only be described as adaptive intelligence systems. Rather than simply modifying existing strategies to cope with changing conditions, they learned to modify their learning processes themselves, developing new ways of acquiring and processing information that allowed them to stay ahead of environmental changes rather than simply reacting to them. They began maintaining what we might recognize today as scenario planning capabilities, developing detailed mental models of multiple possible environmental futures and the hunting strategies that would be most effective under each set of conditions. This required not just intelligence, but meta-intelligence, the ability to think about thinking and to modify cognitive processes based on changing environmental demands. Their pack structure evolved to support these enhanced cognitive capabilities. Individual specialists began developing subspecializations that allowed them to focus on specific aspects of environmental analysis. Weather specialists learned to predict not just immediate climate changes, but longer-term patterns that would affect ecosystem dynamics over seasonal cycles. Vegetation specialists developed the ability to predict how plant communities would respond to different combinations of temperature, rainfall, and soil conditions. But the most remarkable development was the emergence of integration specialists, individuals whose primary function was to synthesize information from multiple other specialists into comprehensive strategic assessments. These integration specialists possessed cognitive abilities that bordered on the extraordinary, capable of processing vast amounts of complex, often contradictory information and extracting actionable strategic insights that could guide pack hunting decisions across multiple time scales. The communication systems required to support these enhanced intelligence capabilities became increasingly sophisticated. Hyenid packs developed what amounted to technical vocabularies, specialized vocalizations, and sense signals that could convey complex information about environmental conditions, prey behavior patterns, and strategic recommendations. Young hyenids spent years learning not just these communication systems, but the analytical frameworks necessary to contribute meaningfully to pack intelligence operations. The competition between these three groups of super predators created an evolutionary arms race that pushed the boundaries of animal intelligence far beyond anything that had previously existed on Earth. Each innovation by one group forced the others to develop counter-strategies that were even more sophisticated, creating a feedback loop that accelerated cognitive evolution at an unprecedented rate. Saber-toothed cats began developing counter-intelligence capabilities designed to detect and neutralize hyenid deception operations. They learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when hyenid behavioral manipulation was taking place and developed techniques for turning those operations against their creators. This required not just intelligence, but the ability to think about how other intelligent creatures were thinking, a level of cognitive sophistication that approached theory of mind capabilities. Amphicyonids developed techniques for disrupting the coordination systems that made hyenid pack hunting so effective. They learned to identify and target the communication networks that hyenid packs relied upon, using coordinated harassment operations designed to interfere with information flow rather than directly attacking pack members. These disruption operations required planning capabilities that matched those of their hyenid targets, while adding an additional layer of tactical complexity. The hyenids responded by developing security protocols for their intelligence operations, creating redundant communication systems, and developing techniques for detecting and countering the disruption operations being mounted against them. They began operating multiple parallel intelligence networks simultaneously, ensuring that the loss of any single information source would not compromise their strategic capabilities. The cognitive demands of this three-way arms race pushed all participants toward levels of intelligence that would have seemed impossible for prehistoric predators. Pack members from all three species developed the ability to maintain awareness of not just their own strategic objectives, but the likely strategic objectives of their competitors. They learned to think in terms of multiple nested layers of deception and counter-deception, planning operations that would succeed even if their opponents correctly anticipated their primary strategies. The social learning systems required to maintain these sophisticated capabilities across generations became increasingly elaborate. Young predators underwent extended training periods that resembled university education more than simple skill acquisition. They learned not just hunting techniques, but analytical methods, communication protocols, and strategic thinking frameworks that prepared them to participate in cognitive competitions that were as demanding as they were deadly. The environmental instability that had triggered these evolutionary innovations continued to intensify as the late Miocene progressed toward its conclusion. The creatures that would survive the coming changes were those that had learned not just to adapt to environmental uncertainty, but to thrive in it. The hunting strategies they had developed would influence predator behavior for millions of years to come, laying the foundation for cognitive capabilities that would eventually influence the evolution of intelligence itself. But even as these remarkable predators were reaching the peak of their evolutionary success, changes were approaching that would test their adaptive capabilities in ways that none of their sophisticated strategies had prepared them for. The stage was set for evolutionary challenges that would reshape the entire landscape of predation in East Africa and determine which hunting philosophies would survive to influence the development of life on Earth for millions of years into the future. As the late Miocene epoch drew toward its close, the sophisticated hunting strategies that had evolved in the East African Rift were about to face their ultimate test. The environmental changes that had been building for thousands of years were accelerating, driven by tectonic forces that were literally reshaping the continent beneath the feet of every creature that called this landscape home. The Great Rift Valley itself was widening and deepening, creating new geological barriers that fragmented territories and disrupted migration routes that had existed for millions of years. Volcanic activity intensified, with eruptions that didn't just change local topography, but altered regional climate patterns through ash clouds that blocked sunlight and changed precipitation patterns across hundreds of miles. But perhaps the most profound change was happening to the forest corridors that had been the lifelines connecting different parts of the ecosystem. These ribbons of dense vegetation that had allowed woodland species to move safely across otherwise open terrain were shrinking and fragmenting. What had once been continuous forest highways became isolated patches of woodland surrounded by expanding grasslands. This fragmentation created what ecologists would later recognize as edge effects on a massive scale. The boundaries between forest and grassland became zones of intense predator activity, as creatures from both environments converged on the limited interfaces between their preferred habitats. These edge zones became laboratories for the evolution of hybrid hunting strategies that combine techniques from both woodland and open grassland environments. The most successful predators were those that learned to exploit these transitional zones rather than being trapped by them. They developed hunting techniques that could function effectively in multiple habitat types, allowing them to maintain territory continuity even as the landscape itself was fragmenting around them. This required not just behavioral flexibility, but the cognitive ability to rapidly assess new environments and adapt hunting strategies in real time. The saber-toothed cats found themselves facing a particularly complex challenge. Their precision ambush techniques had evolved for specific types of terrain, but the rapidly changing landscape meant that optimal ambush sites were constantly shifting. Dense woodland areas that provided perfect concealment one season might be open grassland the next, as changing rainfall patterns and soil conditions altered vegetation communities with unprecedented speed. Their response was to develop what can only be described as modular hunting strategies. Instead of learning fixed techniques for specific environments, they learned fundamental principles that could be rapidly recombined to create effective hunting approaches for novel conditions. Individual cats became specialists in reading terrain potential rather than memorizing specific locations, developing the ability to quickly identify optimal ambush positions in unfamiliar environments. This shift required remarkable cognitive flexibility. Cats had to learn to recognize abstract patterns that indicated favorable hunting conditions, rather than relying on memory of specific geographic features. They developed the ability to assess vegetation density, sight lines, wind patterns, and prey movement channels within minutes of encountering new terrain. Then coordinate with hunting partners to execute ambush strategies adapted to those specific conditions. The social coordination required for these adaptive ambush strategies pushed saber-toothed cat intelligence into new territory. Hunting groups had to communicate complex spatial information rapidly and accurately, describing terrain features and tactical opportunities using vocalizations and body language that could convey precise information about three-dimensional space and movement timing. They developed what amounted to a tactical communication system that allowed them to plan and execute coordinated attacks in environments they had never encountered before. But the fragmentation of forest corridors created opportunities as well as challenges. The edge zones where grassland met woodland became concentration points for prey species that were themselves struggling to adapt to changing habitat conditions. Herbivores that had evolved for forest living found themselves forced to venture into open grassland to reach other forest patches, creating predictable vulnerability windows that clever predators could exploit. The amphicyonids recognized these opportunities earlier than their competitors, developing specialized techniques for hunting in transitional zones that combined elements of their traditional persistence hunting with new approaches adapted to mixed terrain. They learned to use the psychological stress that habitat fragmentation created in prey populations, targeting animals that were already anxious and disoriented by the rapid environmental changes surrounding them. Their pack coordination systems evolved to manage hunts that spanned multiple habitat types simultaneously. Pack members learned to function effectively in both woodland and grassland environments, allowing hunting operations to maintain continuity even as prey moved between different habitat patches. This required individual pack members to develop competency in multiple hunting specializations, creating a level of tactical flexibility that had never been seen before in pack predators. The energy management challenges of hunting across fragmented landscapes were enormous. Amphicyonid packs had to maintain sufficient energy reserves to pursue prey across terrain that might include dense forest, open grassland, rocky outcrops, and wetland areas within a single hunt. They developed sophisticated techniques for pacing their efforts across these varied terrains, learning to conserve energy during phases of the hunt that took place in challenging terrain, while maximizing their efforts during phases that offered optimal conditions for their hunting style. But perhaps most remarkably, they began developing collaborative relationships with other predator species that allowed them to exploit the changing landscape more effectively than any single predator type could manage alone. These interspecies hunting collaborations were unprecedented in the fossil record, representing a level of cognitive sophistication that challenged traditional understanding of predator competition. The most successful of these collaborations developed between amphicyonid packs and certain species of early cursorial birds that were evolving enhanced running abilities in response to the expanding grasslands. These birds served as aerial reconnaissance for amphicyanid hunts, providing information about prey locations and movements across terrain that was difficult for ground-based predators to monitor effectively. The communication systems required for these interspecies collaborations were extraordinarily complex. Amphicyonids had to learn to interpret the vocalizations and flight patterns of their avian partners, while the birds had to understand amphicyanid pack movements and hunting intentions. Both species developed hybrid communication protocols that allowed them to coordinate their activities despite having completely different sensory capabilities and movement patterns. The hyenids, already the most cognitively advanced predators in the ecosystem, responded to landscape fragmentation by developing what can only be described as ecological engineering capabilities. Rather than simply adapting to environmental changes, they began actively manipulating ecosystem dynamics to create hunting opportunities that were more favorable to their strategic approaches. They learned to influence vegetation patterns through selective targeting of herbivore species that were key to maintaining certain plant communities. By eliminating specific browsers or grazers from targeted areas, they could accelerate or slow vegetation changes in ways that created optimal hunting terrain for future operations. This required understanding ecological relationships at a level that approached modern scientific knowledge of ecosystem dynamics. Their intelligence networks expanded to include detailed monitoring of vegetation changes, soil conditions, water table fluctuations, and the complex interactions between different herbivore species and plant communities. Pack members developed specializations in what we might recognize today as ecosystem management, learning to predict how their hunting activities would influence habitat development over periods of years or even decades. The strategic planning required for these ecological engineering operations was breathtaking in its complexity. Hyenid packs had to coordinate hunting activities across multiple timescales simultaneously, balancing immediate nutritional needs against long-term habitat manipulation goals, while maintaining awareness of how their activities might affect the behavior of competing predator species. They developed techniques for creating what military strategists would recognize as strategic depth in their territories. Instead of simply defending fixed boundaries, they created buffer zones where they could manipulate environmental conditions to channel prey movements and limit competitor access. These buffer zones functioned as early warning systems, providing advance notice of changes in prey populations or competitor activities that might affect pack hunting success. The communication systems required to coordinate these multi-layered strategic operations became incredibly sophisticated. Hyenid packs developed specialized roles for strategic planning specialists who functioned as living databases of ecological knowledge and territorial intelligence. These specialists maintain detailed mental maps of environmental conditions across vast areas, tracking changes in vegetation, water sources, prey populations, and competitor activities over extended time periods. But the most remarkable innovation was their development of what can only be called adaptive learning protocols. Rather than simply passing successful strategies from one generation to the next, they began teaching young pack members how to develop new strategies in response to novel environmental challenges. This created a form of cultural evolution that allowed hyenid populations to adapt to changing conditions faster than genetic evolution alone would have permitted. Young hyenids underwent extended educational programs that included not just practical hunting skills, but theoretical frameworks for understanding ecosystem dynamics, strategic planning methodologies, and problem-solving approaches that could be applied to challenges that hadn't existed during previous generations. They learned to learn, developing cognitive flexibility that allowed them to continue adapting throughout their adult lives, rather than simply implementing strategies they had learned during youth. The competition between these three groups of super predators intensified as landscape fragmentation reduced available territory and concentrated prey populations into smaller, more contested areas. The cognitive arms race that had been developing throughout the late Miocene accelerated dramatically. driving all three species toward levels of intelligence that seemed almost impossible for prehistoric animals. Saber-toothed cats began developing counter-engineering strategies designed to neutralize hyaenid habitat manipulation efforts. They learned to recognize the signs of ecological engineering and develop techniques for disrupting these operations without revealing their own intentions. This required not just understanding ecology, but understanding how other intelligent predators thought about ecology. Amphicyonids developed techniques for exploiting the territorial modifications that hyenids created for their own hunting purposes. They learned to identify areas where hyaenid engineering had created conditions that could be advantageous for persistence hunting, then developed methods for accessing these areas without triggering conflicts with their creators. This required remarkable strategic thinking and risk assessment capabilities. The hyenids responded by developing security protocols for their ecological engineering operations, creating multiple redundant habitat manipulation projects, and developing techniques for concealing their engineering activities from competing predators. They began operating what amounted to covert ecosystem modification programs, making environmental changes that appeared natural but were actually carefully orchestrated to serve specific strategic objectives. The social structures required to maintain these increasingly complex hunting strategies underwent dramatic evolution. All three predator groups developed educational systems, leadership hierarchies, and knowledge management protocols that resembled the institutional structures of advanced civilizations more than simple animal social organization. Pack sizes grew larger to accommodate the specialized roles that complex hunting strategies required, but internal organization became more sophisticated to prevent the coordination problems that typically plagued large groups. Individual predators developed multiple specializations, allowing groups to maintain operational effectiveness even when environmental changes eliminated specific ecological niches or territorial resources. The environmental pressures that were driving these evolutionary innovations continued to intensify as the late Miocene progressed toward its conclusion. Climate instability increased, landscape fragmentation accelerated, and the reliable ecological relationships that had supported complex predator strategies for millions of years began breaking down entirely. But rather than being defeated by these challenges, the most successful predators began developing meta-adaptive capabilities, learning not just to adapt to environmental changes, but to adapt their adaptation processes themselves. They developed the cognitive flexibility to modify their learning systems, their social structures, and their strategic planning approaches in response to environmental challenges that had no precedent in their evolutionary history. The hunting strategies that emerged from this period of intense environmental pressure would influence predator evolution for millions of years to come. The cognitive capabilities that developed in response to landscape fragmentation and climate instability laid the foundation for intelligence levels that would eventually influence the evolution of consciousness itself. As the late Miocene epoch approached its end, the stage was set for environmental changes that would test these remarkable adaptations in ways that none of the sophisticated strategies developed during this period had anticipated. The creatures that would survive the coming transitions were those that had learned not just to hunt effectively, but to think about hunting in ways that transcended the specific environmental conditions that had shaped their evolution. The legacy of their innovations would echo through deep time, influencing not just the behavior of future predator species, but the very nature of intelligence and strategic thinking in the animal kingdom. They had proven that the pressure of survival could drive cognitive evolution to heights that seemed to approach the limits of what animal intelligence could achieve. But as we're about to discover, even these remarkable capabilities would be tested by changes that would reshape the fundamental nature of life on Earth. The evolutionary pressures that had been building throughout the late Miocene were about to unleash something unprecedented in the fossil record. As volcanic activity intensified across the East African Rift and climate patterns became increasingly erratic, a new type of predator, began emerging from the shadows of this transformed landscape. These weren't entirely new species, but rather existing hunters that had undergone such dramatic behavioral evolution that they represented something entirely different from their ancestors. The most remarkable of these transformed predators were the early phalids, smaller cats that had been overshadowed by their saber-toothed cousins throughout most of the Miocene. While the massive Mechaerodonts had dominated through size and specialized anatomy, these smaller cats had been quietly developing hunting strategies based on something far more revolutionary than physical adaptation. They had learned to hunt with pure intelligence. Unlike their larger relatives who relied on coordinated group attacks, these early felids developed solitary hunting techniques that required extraordinary cognitive abilities. They became the first truly calculating predators, creatures that could analyze complex situations, predict multiple possible outcomes, and select optimal strategies based on probability assessments that would impress modern game theorists. Their hunting process began long before any physical contact with prey. These cats would spend days observing potential targets, not just learning their movement patterns, but studying their decision-making processes. They developed the ability to recognize individual prey animals and track their behavioral quirks, learning which creatures were more likely to flee in specific directions, which ones would fight when cornered, and which ones could be manipulated through carefully orchestrated psychological pressure. But perhaps most remarkably, they learned to hunt the hunters. These small felids recognized that the complex predator dynamics that had developed in the East African Rift created opportunities for creatures clever enough to exploit them. They began following saber-toothed cat hunting parties at discreet distances, not to scavenge, but to study their techniques and identify weaknesses that could be exploited. They observed amphibianid persistence hunts from concealed positions, learning to predict when pack coordination would break down under stress, and identifying moments when individual pack members became vulnerable to attack. Most audaciously, they began shadowing hyenid intelligence operations, learning to recognize the signs of hyenid strategic planning, and positioning themselves to capitalize on the chaos that complex hyenid hunts inevitably created. This meta-predation required cognitive abilities that pushed the boundaries of what neurologists thought possible for creatures with relatively small brains. These cats had to maintain mental models of not just their own hunting strategies, but the hunting strategies of multiple other predator species. They had to predict how different predator groups would interact with each other and with various prey species under different environmental conditions. The energy efficiency of this intelligence-based hunting approach was extraordinary. While other predators were expending enormous amounts of energy on failed hunts and territorial conflicts, these calculating cats achieved remarkably high success rates with minimal physical effort. They learned to position themselves where successful hunts by other predators were most likely to create secondary opportunities, whether through scattered prey, injured animals, or temporary territorial vacuums. But their most innovative technique was what we might call predictive ambush hunting. Rather than waiting for prey to appear at specific locations, they learned to identify environmental conditions that would force prey to appear at predictable locations in the future. They could read subtle changes in vegetation, water availability, and weather patterns to determine where animals would be compelled to travel days or weeks later. This predictive capability required an understanding of cause and effect relationships that operated across multiple timescales simultaneously. These cats had to understand immediate environmental triggers, seasonal patterns, long-term climate trends, and the complex behavioral responses that different species would exhibit to various combinations of environmental pressures. Their success began influencing the evolution of other predator species in unexpected ways. Saber-toothed cats started incorporating elements of predictive hunting into their group strategies, with individual pack members specializing in environmental analysis and probability assessment. Amphicyonids began developing counterintelligence operations designed to detect and neutralize the surveillance activities of these calculating competitors. The hyenids, already the most cognitively advanced predators in the ecosystem, recognize these small felids as their most serious intellectual rivals. Competition between hyenid packs and individual calculating cats created some of the most sophisticated predator interactions ever recorded in the fossil record, with both sides developing strategies that required multiple layers of deception, counter-deception, and strategic misdirection. But the environmental changes that were transforming the East African landscape were accelerating beyond the ability of even these remarkable predators to adapt. Volcanic eruptions were becoming more frequent and more violent, creating ash clouds that could block sunlight for months and alter precipitation patterns across entire regions. The reliable seasonal cycles that had governed ecosystem dynamics for millions of years were breaking down entirely. The forest corridors that had been fragmenting throughout the late Miocene were now disappearing altogether in many areas, replaced by grasslands that stretched to the horizon. This created vast open spaces that favored entirely different types of hunting strategies, while simultaneously eliminating the ecological niches that had supported the complex predator communities of the earlier Miocene. Water sources, which had been the focal points for much of the strategic maneuvering between different predator groups, became increasingly unpredictable. Rivers that had flowed for millennia dried up within seasons, while new water sources appeared in locations where no permanent water had existed before. This hydrological chaos disrupted migration patterns and forced both predators and prey to develop entirely new behavioral strategies. The most successful predators during this period of environmental upheaval were those that had learned to thrive on chaos itself. They developed hunting strategies that actually became more effective as environmental conditions became more unpredictable, turning instability into a competitive advantage that allowed them to outcompete predators that relied on environmental consistency. These chaos-adapted hunters learned to read the subtle signs that indicated impending environmental changes, positioning themselves to exploit the confusion and displacement that these changes would create among less adaptable species. They developed techniques for hunting during volcanic eruptions, dust storms, and other extreme weather events when traditional predator-prey relationships broke down entirely. Their success required not just behavioral flexibility, but the ability to rapidly modify their sensory processing and decision-making systems in response to changing environmental conditions. They learned to hunt by sound when ash clouds blocked vision, to track by vibration when traditional scent trails were disrupted by volcanic gases, and to coordinate with partners through infrasonic communication when normal vocalizations were drowned out by environmental noise. But perhaps most remarkably, they began developing what can only be described as disaster prediction capabilities. By monitoring subtle changes in animal behavior, seismic activity, atmospheric conditions, and vegetation patterns, they learned to anticipate major environmental disruptions hours or even days before they occurred. This allowed them to position themselves optimally to exploit the hunting opportunities that these disruptions would create. The cognitive demands of disaster prediction required these predators to process vast amounts of complex, often contradictory environmental information and extract meaningful patterns that indicated impending changes. They had to understand not just immediate cause and effect relationships, but the complex cascading effects that environmental changes would have on multiple species across different timescales. Their predictive models became increasingly sophisticated, incorporating factors that ranged from the microscopic to the geological. They learned to recognize how changes in insect behavior might indicate shifts in atmospheric pressure that would precede major storms, how alterations in plant chemistry might signal volcanic activity that wouldn't become visible for days, and how subtle shifts in prey animal vocalizations might indicate seismic events that were below the threshold of conscious detection. The social structures required to support these predictive capabilities underwent dramatic evolution. Individual predators developed specializations in different types of environmental monitoring, creating distributed sensing networks that could detect changes across vast areas and multiple environmental parameters simultaneously. These networks required communication systems sophisticated enough to convey complex technical information rapidly and accurately across considerable distances. But the most extraordinary development was the emergence of what we might call cross-species information sharing. Predators that had been mortal enemies throughout most of the Miocene began developing limited cooperation agreements focused on disaster prediction and response. These agreements weren't based on altruism, but on the recognition that certain types of environmental catastrophes posed threats that no single predator species could handle alone. These interspecies cooperation networks created some of the most complex social structures ever documented in the prehistoric world. Different predator species developed specialized roles in disaster monitoring and response, with each group contributing unique capabilities to collective survival efforts while maintaining competitive relationships in all other aspects of their existence. The information processing requirements for these networks pushed animal intelligence into entirely new territory. Individual predators had to learn to distinguish between information that should be shared for collective benefit and information that should be kept secret for competitive advantage. They had to develop protocols for verifying information received from traditional enemies, while simultaneously managing their own information security to prevent competitors from gaining unfair advantages. The communication systems that evolved to support these networks incorporated elements of what we might recognize today as cryptography and information verification protocols. Different species developed specialized signals that could convey accurate information about environmental threats while simultaneously concealing sensitive details about their own territorial boundaries, resource locations, or hunting strategies. As the environmental chaos of the late Miocene reached its peak, these remarkable predator communities faced challenges that tested every adaptation they had developed over millions of years of evolution. The hunting strategies that had emerged from the competitive pressure between saber-toothed cats, amphissionids, and hyenids had created cognitive capabilities that approached the theoretical limits of animal intelligence. But the environmental changes that were reshaping East Africa were accelerating toward a climax that would determine which of these extraordinary adaptations would survive to influence the future evolution of life on Earth. The stage was set for a final test that would separate the truly revolutionary innovations from the merely remarkable adaptations, determining which hunting strategies would provide the foundation for predator behavior in the dramatically different world that was about to emerge. The creatures that had learned to hunt with their minds rather than just their bodies were about to discover whether intelligence alone would be sufficient to survive the most dramatic environmental transformation in the history of complex life on Earth. Their success or failure would determine not just the future of predation, but the evolutionary trajectory that would eventually lead to the emergence of consciousness itself in the animal kingdom. The final chapter of this extraordinary period was about to unfold in ways that none of these remarkable predators could have anticipated. As the late Miocene epoch reached its climactic conclusion, the environmental forces that had been reshaping East Africa for millions of years were converging toward a transformation so profound it would rewrite the rules of survival entirely. The volcanic activity that had been intensifying throughout this period suddenly reached a crescendo of violence that dwarfed anything in the previous geological record. Massive eruptions along the Rift Valley created ash clouds so dense they blocked sunlight for months at a time, plunging the entire region into an artificial winter that tested every survival strategy that had evolved over the preceding millennia. But it wasn't just the immediate impact of these eruptions that challenged the sophisticated predator communities. The ash fallout fundamentally altered soil chemistry across hundreds of thousands of square miles, triggering vegetation changes that happen not over thousands of years, but within single growing seasons. Plant communities that had supported complex food webs for millions of years simply disappeared, replaced by entirely different botanical assemblages that offered no ecological continuity with the past. The most successful predators during this period of ultimate chaos were those that had learned to abandon specialization entirely. The hunting strategies that had made saber-toothed cats, amphibianids and hyenids so successful during periods of environmental stability became liabilities when the basic parameters of existence changed faster than evolutionary adaptation could follow. A new type of hunter began emerging from this ecological catastrophe. Predators that had learned to hunt adaptability itself. These weren't necessarily the largest or strongest creatures, but they were the ones that had developed metacognitive abilities that allowed them to modify their hunting strategies faster than their prey could develop counter-strategies. These ultimate predators learned to exploit the psychological trauma that rapid environmental change was inflicting on prey species. Herbivores that had evolved sophisticated defensive strategies over millions of years found themselves in landscapes where none of their inherited behaviors were effective. The stress of constant environmental uncertainty made them vulnerable to hunting techniques that would never have succeeded under normal conditions. The most innovative of these chaos hunters developed techniques for amplifying environmental stress to create hunting opportunities. They learned to use the sound of distant volcanic eruptions to trigger panic responses in prey herds, timing their attacks to coincide with seismic events that would mask their approach and disorient their targets. They became masters of hunting in conditions where traditional predator-prey relationships had broken down entirely. But perhaps most remarkably, they began hunting other predators with systematic precision. The complex predator communities that had developed such sophisticated strategies during the stable periods of the Miocene became vulnerable when environmental chaos disrupted the territorial boundaries and resource distribution patterns that had governed their interactions for millions of years. These metapredators learned to identify when traditional hunting groups were most vulnerable to attack, targeting saber-toothed cat ambush parties during the confusion of volcanic ash storms, attacking amphibianid packs when persistence hunts were disrupted by sudden environmental changes, and exploiting the communication breakdowns that environmental chaos created in hyenid intelligence networks. The cognitive demands of this multi-level predation were staggering. These hunters had to maintain awareness of environmental conditions, prey behavior, competitor activities, and their own resource management needs simultaneously, while adapting their strategies in real time to conditions that changed faster than conscious decision-making could follow. They developed what can only be described as intuitive strategic thinking, the ability to make optimal tactical decisions based on pattern recognition that operated below the level of conscious analysis. Their success required them to develop social structures that were simultaneously more flexible and more coordinated than anything that had existed before. They formed hunting groups that could reorganize their composition and tactics within minutes, with individual members switching roles based on immediate environmental conditions rather than predetermined specializations. These adaptive hunting groups developed communication systems that functioned effectively even when traditional sensory channels were disrupted by environmental chaos. They learned to coordinate through vibrations transmitted through the ground when volcanic gases made scent-based communication impossible, through infrasonic calls when ash clouds absorbed higher frequency sounds, and through tactile signals when visibility dropped to zero during dust storms. But the most extraordinary innovation was their development of predictive behavioral modeling. Rather than simply observing how prey and competitors behaved under current conditions, they learned to predict how environmental changes would affect behavior patterns days or weeks in advance. This required them to understand not just the immediate responses that different species would exhibit to environmental stress, but the cascade of behavioral changes that would follow as those immediate responses created new pressures and opportunities. Their predictive models incorporated factors that modern behavioral ecologists would recognize as cutting-edge science. They learned to predict how nutritional stress would affect decision-making processes in prey species, how territorial displacement would alter competitive relationships between different predator groups, and how the breakdown of traditional food webs would create entirely new ecological niches that could be exploited by sufficiently adaptive hunters. The success of these predictive hunting strategies created evolutionary pressure that forced all surviving predator species to develop enhanced cognitive abilities or face extinction. The arms race that had been driving predator intelligence throughout the Miocene accelerated dramatically, pushing animal cognition toward levels that seemed to approach the theoretical limits of what neural systems could achieve. Saber-toothed cats that survived this period developed cognitive abilities that were dramatically enhanced compared to their earlier ancestors. They learned to process complex environmental information rapidly enough to modify their hunting strategies in real time, developing techniques that combined their traditional precision strikes with the adaptive flexibility that environmental chaos demanded. The most successful amphissionid packs developed distributed intelligence systems that could maintain coordination even when environmental conditions prevented direct communication between pack members. Individual pack members learned to function as autonomous decision-making units while remaining connected to larger strategic objectives through protocols that could operate effectively even under the most chaotic environmental conditions. The hyenids, already the most cognitively advanced predators in the ecosystem, underwent cognitive evolution that pushed their intelligence into entirely new territory. They developed what can only be described as consciousness of their own thinking processes, the ability to monitor and modify their strategic planning capabilities based on changing environmental demands. But even as these remarkable predators were reaching unprecedented levels of cognitive sophistication, the environmental changes that were driving their evolution were building toward a climax that would test every adaptation they had developed. The volcanic activity that had been reshaping the landscape throughout the late Miocene was approaching a series of super eruptions that would fundamentally alter the climate of the entire African continent. The ash clouds from these super eruptions would block sunlight for years rather than months, creating a prolonged period of environmental stress that would eliminate many of the ecological relationships that had supported complex predator communities. The temperature drops caused by reduced solar radiation would trigger vegetation changes that would cascade through every level of the food web, creating selection pressures that would favor entirely different types of survival strategies. The predators that would survive this ultimate environmental test were those that had learned not just to adapt to environmental change, but to use environmental change as a tool for evolutionary advancement. They had developed the cognitive flexibility to abandon successful strategies when environmental conditions made them obsolete, and the creativity to develop entirely new approaches to survival under conditions that had no precedent in evolutionary history. Their hunting strategies had evolved far beyond simple predation to become sophisticated systems for exploiting the fundamental uncertainty that characterized life during periods of rapid environmental change. They had learned to hunt opportunity itself, positioning themselves to benefit from the chaos that destroyed less adaptable species, while simultaneously developing the resilience to survive conditions that would have eliminated their ancestors. The legacy of these ultimate predators would extend far beyond their own survival. The cognitive capabilities they developed in response to the environmental chaos of the late Miocene would influence the evolution of intelligence throughout the animal kingdom for millions of years to come. They had proven that under sufficient evolutionary pressure, animal cognition could develop capabilities that approach the complexity of human strategic thinking. Their innovations in social coordination, environmental analysis, predictive modeling, and adaptive learning would provide the foundation for cognitive abilities that would eventually influence the development of consciousness itself. They had demonstrated that intelligence was not just a tool for survival, but a mechanism for transcending the limitations that environmental constraints typically imposed on biological systems. The hunting strategies they pioneered would continue to influence predator behavior long after the specific environmental conditions that created them had passed. Their techniques for exploiting uncertainty, coordinating complex group activities, and adapting strategies in real time would be rediscovered and refined by predator species throughout the remainder of Earth's biological history. But perhaps their greatest contribution was their demonstration that cooperation between traditionally competitive species could create capabilities that transcended what any individual species could achieve alone. The interspecies information sharing networks they developed proved that evolutionary pressure could overcome even the most fundamental competitive instincts when survival demanded collective action. As the late Miocene epoch reached its final climax, these remarkable predators had transformed the very nature of what it meant to hunt successfully in a changing world. They had evolved from simple killers into strategic thinkers whose cognitive abilities approached the complexity that would eventually characterize human intelligence. Their success had proven that under the right conditions, evolutionary pressure could drive animal cognition to heights that seemed to transcend the biological limitations that had constrained life throughout most of Earth's history. The stage was set for environmental changes that would determine which of these extraordinary adaptations would survive to influence the future evolution of life on Earth. The creatures that had learned to hunt with pure intelligence were about to face the ultimate test of whether cognitive ability alone could overcome environmental challenges that threatened the very foundations of complex life. Their story represents one of the most remarkable chapters in the evolution of intelligence, a demonstration of how environmental pressure can drive cognitive development to levels that seem almost supernatural by the standards of modern animal behavior. The hunting strategies they developed would echo through deep time, influencing not just the behavior of future predator species, but the fundamental nature of strategic thinking itself in the animal kingdom. The environmental catastrophe that was approaching would separate the truly revolutionary innovations from the merely remarkable adaptations, determining which cognitive capabilities would provide the foundation for intelligence in the dramatically different world that was about to emerge. The predators that had learned to thrive on chaos itself were about to discover whether their ultimate adaptation would be sufficient to survive the most extreme environmental transformation in the history of complex life on Earth. The transformation that was reshaping the East African landscape was about to reveal its most profound secret. As the environmental chaos reached its crescendo, something unprecedented began emerging from the volcanic highlands that bordered the Rift Valley. New players were entering the predator arena, creatures whose hunting strategies would make even the most sophisticated innovations of the late Miocene seem primitive by comparison. These weren't entirely new species, but rather existing inhabitants of the highland forests, who had been forced to adapt to conditions so extreme that they had undergone behavioral evolution at a pace that seemed to defy biological possibility. The mountain forests that had remained relatively stable while the lowlands underwent dramatic changes had become laboratories for the development of hunting techniques that operated on principles no lowland predator had ever conceived. The most remarkable of these highland innovators were the arboreal hunters, who had learned to exploit the three-dimensional hunting opportunities that forest environments provided. But these weren't simple tree-dwelling ambush predators. They had developed aerial hunting strategies that combined the precision of saber-toothed cats, the persistence of amphicyonids, and the intelligence of hyenids into something entirely new. Their hunting process began in the forest canopy, where they had learned to read the landscape from above in ways that ground-based predators could never match. From elevated positions 50 or 60 feet above the forest floor, they could observe prey movements across vast areas, tracking multiple herds simultaneously while remaining completely invisible to ground-dwelling creatures. But their aerial perspective provided more than just enhanced surveillance capabilities. They had learned to understand the complex relationship between canopy structure and ground-level movement patterns, recognizing how the arrangement of trees, the density of understory vegetation, and the positioning of natural clearings would channel animal movements in predictable ways. These canopy hunters developed techniques for manipulating ground-level prey behavior through carefully orchestrated disturbances in the forest structure above. They learned to create sounds and movements in the canopy that would trigger specific behavioral responses in ground-dwelling animals, essentially herding their prey toward predetermined locations without ever revealing their presence. The coordination required for these aerial herding operations was extraordinary. Multiple hunters positioned themselves throughout the forest canopy, maintaining visual contact across distances that might span several miles, while simultaneously monitoring the movements of prey animals on the forest floor below. They developed communication systems that allowed them to coordinate complex herding maneuvers using vocalizations that mimicked natural forest sounds, making their coordinated activities virtually undetectable to prey species. But perhaps most remarkably, they learned to hunt in 3 dimensions simultaneously. While ground-based predators were limited to horizontal movement patterns, these arboreal hunters could attack from above, below, and from multiple directions at once. Their prey, evolved to watch for threats approaching from ground level, had no defensive strategies for attacks that came from the forest canopy. Their physical adaptations for 3-dimensional hunting were as impressive as their behavioral innovations. They developed enhanced spatial awareness that allowed them to navigate complex 3-dimensional environments at high speed, while maintaining awareness of prey movements on the ground below. Their depth perception and distance judgment abilities were refined to levels that allowed them to execute precision attacks from heights that would disorient most terrestrial predators. The energy efficiency of their hunting strategies was remarkable. By using gravity to assist their attacks, they could generate impact forces far greater than their body weight would suggest possible. They learned to calculate trajectory angles that would maximize impact while minimizing their own energy expenditure, turning the forest structure itself into a weapon delivery system. But their most innovative technique was what we might call cascade hunting. They discovered that successful attacks on individual prey animals would create panic responses that could be predicted and exploited to generate opportunities for additional kills within the same hunting episode. By timing their attacks to trigger maximum disruption in prey herds, they could create chaotic situations where multiple hunting opportunities would present themselves simultaneously. The psychological warfare aspects of their hunting strategies were equally sophisticated. They learned to create an atmosphere of generalized terror in prey populations through carefully timed demonstrations of their attacking capabilities. By allowing some prey animals to escape after witnessing attacks on their companions, they could spread fear throughout entire populations, making all members of those populations more vulnerable to future hunting attempts. Their success began attracting the attention of lowland predators who were struggling to adapt to the changing environmental conditions. The complex hunting strategies that had evolved in response to stable lowland environments were proving inadequate for dealing with the rapid environmental changes that volcanic activity was creating. Some of the most adaptable lowland hunters began attempting to learn from these highland innovations. The knowledge transfer between highland and lowland predator communities created some of the most remarkable examples of interspecies learning ever documented in the fossil record. Lowland predators who had never operated in 3-dimensional environments began developing modified versions of arboreal hunting techniques that could be applied in the increasingly fragmented landscapes of the Rift Valley floor. Saber-toothed cats started incorporating elevated attack positions into their ambush strategies, learning to use rock outcrops and isolated trees to gain height advantages that increased the effectiveness of their precision strikes. They developed techniques for reading terrain from elevated positions that allowed them to identify optimal ambush locations across much larger areas than ground-level observation would permit. Amphicyanid packs began experimenting with 3-dimensional coordination strategies that allowed different pack members to attack from multiple vertical levels simultaneously. Some pack members specialized in climbing abilities that allowed them to position themselves on rocky ledges or in isolated trees, coordinating their attacks with ground-based pack members to create multi-level hunting operations. The hyenids with their already advanced intelligence capabilities, proved most adept at incorporating highland hunting innovations into their lowland strategies. They began developing what can only be described as architectural hunting techniques, learning to use both natural and modified terrain features to create three-dimensional hunting environments in areas that had previously offered only horizontal hunting opportunities. Their engineering capabilities expanded to include the construction of elevated hunting platforms using combinations of rock, vegetation, and deliberately modified terrain features. These constructed hunting positions allowed them to apply aerial hunting principles in environments where natural elevated positions were not available, essentially creating artificial forest canopies in grassland environments. The environmental monitoring capabilities that hyenids had developed during the earlier phases of the Miocene proved invaluable for predicting how continued environmental changes would affect the availability of three-dimensional hunting opportunities. They learned to anticipate how vegetation changes, erosion patterns, and seismic activity would alter the terrain features that their new hunting strategies depended upon. But the most extraordinary development was their creation of what we might recognize today as training facilities for three-dimensional hunting. Hyenid packs began constructing complex terrain modifications that allowed pack members to practice elevated hunting techniques under controlled conditions, developing the spatial awareness and coordination skills that three-dimensional hunting required without the risks associated with actual hunting attempts. These training facilities represented a level of forward planning and educational sophistication that challenged traditional understanding of animal learning capabilities. Pack members underwent extended training programs that included not just physical skill development, but theoretical instruction in three-dimensional spatial relationships, trajectory calculation, and the complex coordination protocols that multi-level hunting operations required. The success of these highland-influenced hunting strategies created evolutionary pressure that forced all surviving lowland predators to develop enhanced three-dimensional awareness or risk being outcompeted by more adaptable rivals. The cognitive demands of three-dimensional hunting pushed animal spatial intelligence into entirely new territory, requiring predators to maintain mental models of complex three-dimensional environments while simultaneously tracking the movements of prey and coordinating with hunting partners positioned at different elevations. The communication systems required for three-dimensional hunting coordination became incredibly sophisticated. Predators had to develop signals that could convey precise three-dimensional positional information, timing sequences for multi-level attacks, and tactical modifications based on real-time changes in prey behavior and environmental conditions. These communication systems incorporated elements of what we might recognize today as air traffic control protocols, allowing multiple hunting units to coordinate their movements through three-dimensional space without colliding or interfering with each other's attacks. The social structures that evolved to support three-dimensional hunting were equally complex. Hunting groups developed specialized roles for spatial coordination specialists who functioned as three-dimensional tactical directors, maintaining awareness of the positions and movements of all hunting participants while calculating optimal attack sequences based on constantly changing conditions. Individual hunters within these groups developed multiple specializations that allowed them to function effectively at different elevations and in different phases of multidimensional hunting operations. Some individuals specialized in high-altitude reconnaissance and prey herding. Others focused on mid-level coordination and communication, while others became experts in ground-level prey manipulation and final attack execution. The training systems required to develop these diverse skill sets became increasingly elaborate. Young predators underwent educational programs that included not just practical hunting instruction, but theoretical education in spatial mathematics, three-dimensional navigation, and the complex physics of trajectory calculation and impact force optimization. But perhaps most remarkably, these three-dimensional hunting specialists began developing what can only be described as architectural intelligence. They learned to read natural terrain features and vegetation patterns, to identify locations where temporary three-dimensional hunting structures could be constructed, then developed techniques for modifying those locations to optimize their effectiveness for specific types of prey and hunting conditions. Their architectural capabilities extended beyond simple platform construction to include the creation of complex three-dimensional trap systems that could channel prey movements through predetermined paths while positioning hunting participants at optimal locations for coordinated attacks. These trap systems incorporated principles of engineering and behavioral psychology that wouldn't be seen again until the development of human technology thousands of years later. The environmental changes that continued to reshape the East African landscape provided both challenges and opportunities for these three-dimensional hunting innovations. Increased volcanic activity created new elevated terrain features that could be exploited for hunting purposes, while simultaneously destroying existing forest canopy that had provided natural three-dimensional hunting environments. The most adaptable predators learned to exploit the temporary elevated features created by volcanic activity, developing techniques for hunting from the rims of new craters, the slopes of fresh volcanic cones, and the elevated areas created by lava flows that had cooled and solidified. These temporary hunting opportunities required rapid adaptation capabilities, as the geological features they depended upon might be altered or destroyed by subsequent volcanic activity within days or weeks. Their success in exploiting these ephemeral hunting opportunities required them to develop geological intelligence capabilities that allowed them to predict how ongoing volcanic activity would affect terrain features over short time periods. They learned to read subtle signs of geological instability that indicated when elevated hunting positions might collapse or when new elevated features might become available. The integration of geological awareness into hunting strategy represented another leap forward in predator intelligence. These hunters had to understand not just animal behavior and environmental patterns, but the complex geological processes that were actively reshaping their hunting territories on timescales that ranged from hours to seasons. Their geological intelligence capabilities allowed them to turn environmental instability into a competitive advantage, positioning themselves to exploit new hunting opportunities as they emerged while avoiding the dangers that geological activity posed to less geologically aware competitors. They became masters of hunting in environments that were literally changing beneath their feet, turning geological chaos into tactical advantage. The success of these geologically aware three-dimensional hunters created the final phase of the predator arms race that had been developing throughout the late Miocene. Their hunting capabilities were so advanced that they began eliminating not just prey species, but competing predator species that couldn't match their adaptive flexibility and three-dimensional hunting capabilities. The environmental pressures that had driven predator evolution throughout the Miocene were reaching a climax that would determine which hunting innovations would survive to influence the future development of life on Earth. The creatures that had learned to hunt in three dimensions, while adapting to ongoing geological chaos, represented the ultimate expression of predator evolution during this remarkable period. Their cognitive capabilities approached levels that seemed to transcend the biological constraints that had limited animal intelligence throughout most of evolutionary history. They had developed strategic thinking abilities, spatial intelligence, social coordination skills, and adaptive learning capabilities that wouldn't be matched by any other animal species for millions of years. The hunting strategies they pioneered would continue to influence predator behavior long after the specific environmental conditions that created them had passed into geological history. Their innovations in three-dimensional hunting, architectural intelligence, and geological awareness would provide the foundation for cognitive capabilities that would eventually influence the evolution of intelligence itself in the animal kingdom. As the late Miocene epoch approached its final conclusion, these remarkable predators had transformed the very nature of what it meant to be a successful hunter in a changing world. They had proven that under sufficient evolutionary pressure, animal intelligence could develop to levels that seemed to approach the complexity that would eventually characterize human cognitive abilities. The stage was set for the ultimate test of whether these extraordinary adaptations would be sufficient to survive the climactic environmental changes that were about to reshape the African continent entirely. The predators that had learned to hunt with three-dimensional intelligence were about to discover whether even their remarkable capabilities would be enough to overcome the most extreme environmental transformation in the history of complex life. Their legacy would extend far beyond their own survival, influencing the evolution of strategic thinking, spatial intelligence, and adaptive learning throughout the animal kingdom for millions of years to come. They had written the final chapter in one of the most extraordinary periods of cognitive evolution in Earth's biological history, demonstrating that the pressure of survival could drive animal intelligence to heights that seemed to transcend the very nature of biological possibility. The climactic environmental transformation that was reshaping East Africa was about to reveal its most devastating secret. As the super eruptions reached their peak intensity, something unprecedented began happening to the very fabric of life in the Rift Valley. The ash clouds that had been blocking sunlight for months were creating a cascade of ecological collapse that would test every hunting innovation that had evolved over millions of years. But from this apparent catastrophe, the most extraordinary predator evolution in Earth's history was about to emerge. Deep within the volcanic highlands, where the environmental chaos was most intense, a new type of hunter was developing capabilities that seemed to defy every biological principle that had governed predator evolution throughout the Miocene. These weren't just adaptations to environmental change. They were transcendental leaps in cognitive ability that pushed animal intelligence into territory that wouldn't be seen again for millions of years. The creatures emerging from this crucible of environmental destruction had learned to hunt time itself. They developed the ability to perceive patterns across temporal scales that ranged from seconds to seasons, reading the complex rhythms of environmental change with such precision that they could predict prey behavior days or weeks before those behaviors manifested. Their minds had become living calendars of ecological possibility, tracking the intricate timing relationships that governed every aspect of life in their transformed world. Their hunting strategies operated on multiple temporal dimensions simultaneously. While engaging in immediate predation activities, they were simultaneously positioning themselves for hunting opportunities that wouldn't materialize for days, weeks, or even months. They learned to sacrifice short-term hunting success for long-term strategic positioning, demonstrating patience and forward planning that approached human levels of temporal reasoning. The environmental monitoring systems they developed were nothing short of extraordinary. Individual hunters specialized in detecting changes across different temporal scales, with some focusing on minute-by-minute variations in atmospheric conditions, while others tracked seasonal patterns that spanned entire years. These temporal specialists could read the subtle signs that indicated how immediate environmental changes would cascade into long-term ecological transformations. Their communication systems evolved to convey information across multiple timescales simultaneously. A single vocalization might contain immediate tactical information, intermediate strategic updates, and long-term ecological assessments, all encoded in different frequency ranges and temporal patterns. Pack members learned to decode these multi-layered messages while simultaneously contributing their own temporal intelligence to the collective knowledge base. The social structures required to support this temporal hunting approach were unlike anything that had existed before in the animal kingdom. Hunting groups developed hierarchical specializations based on temporal perspective, with different individuals responsible for planning and coordination across different time horizons. Some members focused on immediate tactical execution, others on intermediate strategic positioning, while the most cognitively advanced individuals maintained awareness of long-term ecological trends that would influence hunting success over multiple seasons. But perhaps most remarkably, these temporal hunters began developing what can only be described as historical consciousness. They maintained detailed mental records of past environmental changes and hunting outcomes, using this historical database to refine their predictive models and improve their strategic planning. They could learn from events that had occurred years earlier, incorporating those lessons into current hunting strategies with a sophistication that challenged every assumption about animal memory and learning capabilities. As we close this journey through the East African Rift of 6.3 million years ago, we've witnessed something truly extraordinary. The birth of strategic thinking itself, written in the bones and behaviors of creatures whose names have been lost to time, but whose legacy echoes through every successful hunt that happens today. These remarkable predators didn't just survive in a changing world, they rewrote the very meaning of intelligence in the animal kingdom, proving that under the right pressures, evolution can drive cognitive abilities to heights that seem almost impossible. Evolution can drive cognitive abilities to heights that seem almost impossible.